Have you ever stopped to think about how 450 years of relentless turbulence, exploitation, and defiance can completely forge the identity of an entire subcontinent? Well, in this explainer, we are jumping right into a truly fascinating journey through modern Indian history. We're going to unpack the era stretching from the late 15th century all the way up to 1947, tracing this incredible, hard-fought journey of awakening that still absolutely defines the geopolitical reality of South Asia today.
To make sense of this massive timeline without getting lost in the weeds, we're going to break it down into 6 core eras: the Mughal decline, the tightening grip of British control, those very early sparks of rebellion, the organized rise of nationalism, the shift to mass movements, and finally, that massive final step toward freedom.
So, let's kick things off with era number 1, the Mughal decline and foreign entry.
Okay, picture this. It's 1707. Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb has just died, and his passing triggers a massive, chaotic power vacuum across India. But the build-up to this actually started way earlier. Vasco da Gama had bypassed the old land routes to arrive by sea in 1498, and following him, a rush of European entities, the English, Dutch, and French East India companies. Now here's a wild fact to keep in mind. These weren't just your standard spice merchants. They were essentially heavily armed rogue megacorporations. As the Mughal Empire fractured into fighting regional states, these companies realized they could use their superior naval tech to pivot from just making a profit to actually seizing political strongholds.
That brings us right into Era 2, British economic and political control.
So, after the British East India Company won some major military victories, like Plassey in 1757 and Buxar in 1764, they essentially took over. But how did a corporation govern a massive population? They used a devastating loophole known as dual government. Implemented in Bengal, the company took the Diwani, meaning they grabbed the absolute right to collect all the tax money. But, and this is the kicker, they left the actual job of running the state and caring for the people to the local Nawab. Imagine having all the responsibility of administration, but zero actual funds and zero power. The British had total control with absolutely no accountability. The exploitation was so intense that it directly fueled the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1770, where millions of people tragically starved.
And the political stranglehold only got tighter through some incredibly aggressive legal maneuvering. Enter Lord Dalhousie and his infamous Doctrine of Lapse. This policy basically stated that if an Indian ruler died without a natural-born male heir, they couldn't just adopt a son to take over, which was a deeply rooted tradition. Instead, their state would be automatically swallowed up by the British Empire. It was a blatant land grab. They used it to strip sovereignty from states like Jhansi, Satara, and Nagpur, which, as you can guess, built up immense, boiling resentment across the country.
On the economic side of things, the British totally overhauled land taxation just to maximize how much wealth they could extract. They set up the Zamindari system in the east, creating this whole class of landlord middlemen demanding fixed revenues. Down in the south, they used the Ryadawari system, taxing farmers directly. But honestly, the structural differences didn't matter one bit to the people on the ground. The universal outcome was the absolute crushing of the Indian peasantry. Farmers were taxed into oblivion even if a drought wiped out their crops, leading to huge debts, lost land, and deep systemic poverty.
All of this systemic extraction was brilliantly captured by early nationalist Dadabhai Naoroji in his concept, the drain of wealth. He looked at the hard data and proved that India's resources weren't just being taxed, they were being systematically pumped out to bankroll Britain's own industrial revolution. And while Britain industrialized, India was actively deindustrialized. The British flooded local markets with cheap, factory-made goods, which completely destroyed India's historically world-renowned artisan craftsmen and handloom textile industries. It was an economic dismantling.
Which leads us to Era 3, the first sparks of rebellion.
Now, people didn't just sit back and take this. Long before there was any organized national movement, tribes and peasant communities fought back fiercely when their survival and cultures were threatened. We're talking about the Coal Uprising in 1831 and the massive Santal Hole of 1855, where thousands of tribal people rose up against brutal new forest laws and predatory moneylenders. A few years later, during the Indigo Revolt of 1859, farmers in Bengal just outright refused to plant cash crops for the British. They quite literally declared they would rather beg than plant one more indigo seed.
These scattered regional fires eventually merged into a massive inferno, the 1857 Revolt, often referred to as India's first war of independence. You've probably heard how it was sparked by a rumor that the new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, deeply offending both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The rebellion exploded, uniting soldiers, peasants, and ousted royalty across north and central India. It was huge. But it brings up a really critical question. With all that momentum, why did this massive uprising ultimately fall short?
Well, mechanically, it was pretty disjointed. There was no single unified central leadership. Rebels were basically fighting for their own local leaders. On top of that, they were up against the British, who had superior weapons and were already using the telegraph and railways to rapidly move troops and communicate. Plus, the revolt was geographically limited to the north and center, and actually, a lot of local rulers and newly educated classes stayed totally neutral or even backed the British. But here's the thing. While it failed militarily, it was an absolute game changer. It birthed a real national consciousness and forced the British Crown to finally dissolve the East India Company and take direct control in 1858.
That shifts us into Era 4, the rise of nationalism.
So the sword was gradually replaced by organized thought. Spurred by new socio-religious reform movements and a growing press, the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. But pretty quickly, a really fascinating split happened within the Congress. You had the moderates, who genuinely believed in the British sense of justice. Their whole strategy was prayer and petition, writing polite memos asking for legislative tweaks. But progress was agonizingly slow, and that frustration gave rise to a much more aggressive faction known as the extremists. They were done with polite letters. They demanded direct action, active resistance, and Swadeshi, which meant a total uncompromising boycott of all foreign goods.
You can really feel the energy of this shift in Bal Gangadhar Tilak's legendary battle cry, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." When the British tried to partition Bengal in 1905 to divide people along religious lines, the plan totally blew up in their faces. It acted like pouring gasoline on a fire, igniting the massive Swadeshi movement and cementing this fierce, uncompromising demand for Swaraj, complete self-rule.
Next, we enter Era 5, the era of mass movements. So this intellectual, political struggle was about to get a massive jolt and transform into a true grassroots movement. The catalyst? The return of Mahatma Gandhi to India in 1915. He brought his philosophy of satyagraha, nonviolent resistance. He proved it worked in local disputes like the Champaran Satyagraha in 1917. But then came 1919. The British passed the Draconian Rowlatt Act, protests erupted, and it led to the horrifying Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where British troops gunned down an unarmed crowd. That atrocity instantly shattered any lingering illusion of British justice. In response, Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement in 1920. This was a massive deal, the first truly all-India mass movement, asking everyone to boycott British titles, courts, and products.
But you know, revolutions are rarely a straight line. They have a distinct ebb and flow. In 1922, a violent clash at Chauri Chora made Gandhi hit the brakes entirely on the non-cooperation movement to preserve his strict non-violent principles. That sudden halt frustrated a lot of young activists, leading to a surge in revolutionary groups like the HSRA, with figures like Bhagat Singh turning to armed resistance. But the broader political wave swelled again. By 1929, at the Lahore session, the Congress officially drew a line in the sand: Purna Swaraj, complete independence. And in 1930, Gandhi's iconic Dandi March to defy the British salt tax set off the massive civil disobedience movement.
Now for the climax, Era 6, the final step toward freedom.
We are now in the 1940s, right in the middle of World War II. The British Empire is globally exhausted, and Indian patience is absolutely gone. In August 1942, the Congress launched the Quit India movement. Gandhi's message was brutally simple and intense: do or die. The British panicked and arrested virtually all the senior leaders by the next morning. But it didn't even matter. The movement transformed into a spontaneous, leaderless, nationwide uprising. People were tearing up rail lines and setting up parallel governments. It was the moment the British realized their control was fundamentally, irreversibly broken.
After the war, the dominoes fell incredibly fast. The public trials of Subhash Chandra Bose, Indian National Army officers in 1945 caused massive outrage. And then, early in 1946, the Royal Indian Navy mutinied. This was a literal shock to the system for the British. The military was the core pillar of their power in India, and now the soldiers were turning their guns around. Realizing the game was up, the British sent the cabinet mission in 1946 to negotiate a transfer of power.
But getting to the finish line was bitterly complicated. Efforts to keep the subcontinent united completely fell apart due to severe clashes between the Congress and the Muslim League. Tensions boiled over on Direct Action Day in 1946, sparking horrific communal violence. Ultimately, this tragic reality forced the 1947 Mountbatten Plan, partitioning the land into two distinct independent dominions, India and Pakistan. The British Parliament passed the Independence Act, and at midnight on August 15, 1947, India finally awoke to freedom. But it was a monumental triumph, forever scarred by the immense human cost and trauma of partition.
And so, that brings us to the end of this intense 450-year era. The British were finally gone, but they left behind one heck of a messy puzzle. There were hundreds of semi-autonomous princely states left sitting there, given the choice to join India, join Pakistan, or just stay independent. So I want to leave you with this thought to chew on. With independence finally declared, how on earth was this newly fractured, bleeding nation going to convince all those princely states to integrate and actually forge the unified Democratic Republic of India we know today? Well, that is a whole other incredible story. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.